Right, so this presentation obviously is on free will, which is one of the more interesting and sort of confusing topics in philosophy, but sort of a classic for intro philosophy classes. So just a little bit of stage setting here before we kind of get into it. So there's obviously like lots of things happen. So for example, rivers, they flow towards the ocean or lake or whatever body of water, and the river sort of follows a particular path, but we would never want to say that the river chooses the path in anything more than a just kind of metaphorical way. We don't think that it really chooses in the sense that the river has free will, and among the variety of options of paths, the river uses its free will to choose a specific path and avoid other paths. No, what actually happens is that the river follows a particular path because of the local topography, the local geology, and sort of where erosion can happen more easily. And if it hits a bump, it's going to avoid that bump. And then of course gravity and the amount of rainfall or precipitation of one kind or another that's sort of pushing the river forward. So it's all of these, so to speak, natural things that are sort of mindless natural processes that determine what direction the river is going to go on its path. So of course it's not free will. And that's true for most things in the universe, right? In nature. Most things in nature behave according to what I just described, right? They just kind of unfold. They're determined by, we might say, the laws of nature, and whatever the initial conditions were at the beginning of whatever process we're thinking of, it just sort of unfolds in a certain way according to sort of the laws of physics, we might say. But we, humans, we're different, right? We have free will, and so we are not merely sort of subject to just the laws of nature sort of pushing us in an inevitable direction, and instead we can decide for ourselves what decisions to make and what behaviors to exhibit. So, for example, let's say that you are sort of at a cafeteria and you're getting your lunch, and you come to the end of the line there, and now the choices for dessert are in front of you. And these are your two choices. You could pick a peach, nice and healthy, but also delicious, or that chocolate cake. Now, when I'm faced with this kind of a choice, I would usually exercise my free will to go for the chocolate. But the idea is that it's my choice, right? I can decide for myself what I want to do. But let's go ahead and say that you do choose the cake. But then after choosing the cake, you think to yourself, oh, that was kind of fattening. I don't need all that sugar. And I could have used something a little bit more healthy like that peach. And so I should have chosen that peach instead of the cake. And in addition, since it was my free choice, I would also perhaps say that I could have chosen the peach instead. Right? Not just that I should have, but that I actually could have chosen the peach, right? It's up to me, it's my free will. So imagine if somehow we were able to rewind history back to that moment, just the one instant before I actually made the decision to get the cake. I could have, so this idea goes, I could have, instead of choosing the cake, I could have gone for the peach. That's kind of the common sense notion of free will. That you could have done differently than you actually did. In the literature on this topic, it's referred to as libertarian free will. And that's not necessarily the same at all as sort of the libertarian political viewpoint or sort of economic viewpoint. This is specifically applied to the context of free will. So libertarian meaning we do have free will, and free will matches the sort of common sense notion that you could have done differently than you actually did. Okay, so that seems fairly reasonable. Certainly that's sort of how I feel with my decision making and my history of decision making. But now consider this argument. Natural processes, as I talked about at the beginning of all this, they unfold according to, for lack of a better term, the laws of nature. And those laws are unbreakable, right? The results of those of natural processes unfolding according to the laws of nature, those results are inevitable. Given specific starting point, given initial starting conditions, the laws of nature will sort of do their work, so to speak, and produce a very specific outcome, and that outcome is inevitable. But the more we sort of learn about ourselves from a scientific standpoint, the more we realize that, you know, our bodies, including our brains that come up with all these decisions and all these behaviors, they operate according to natural processes, right? So it's electrical impulses and electrochemical gradients and synapses and neurotransmitters binding and those sorts of things. That's all natural. You know, that's just biology. Really, it's ultimately biochemistry. So it seems then that all of my thoughts and behaviors result from the natural processes in my brain. And if these are natural processes, well, then that brings us back to premise one here, which is that natural processes unfold according to the laws of nature, and therefore the results are inevitable. So therefore, all of my thoughts and behaviors are inevitable. I could not have chosen other than I actually did, right? I chose the cake. And so if we were to rewind history back to that instant just before I chose the cake, and all the conditions leading up to that choice were exactly the same as they were the first time through, then I'm going to choose the cake again, right? There's no way that I can somehow like break the chain that was leading to the chain of causation that was leading to me picking the cake, and somehow break that and shift over to choosing the peach, because that would be breaking the laws of nature. And according to the first premise here, we can't do that, right? So this viewpoint is called determinism. Here's another way of viewing it, right? It's the initial conditions plus the laws of nature give us this inevitable outcome. So determinism, this means that basically the libertarian free will does not exist. In fact, we might even say that no free will exists, right? Everything is determined. Given the initial conditions and the laws of nature, everything that happens is determined by those laws of nature and the initial conditions. And in fact, we could sort of think far, far, far back into our history, before we were even born, before there was an Earth, before there was a solar system, go all the way back to the Big Bang. That was the real initial conditions. So given those initial conditions, let's say, you know, a few milliseconds after the Big Bang, when sort of the laws of nature, according to our current understanding, were in place. And so whatever those conditions were just a few milliseconds after the Big Bang, then combine that with the laws of nature, and everything that's happened after that is inevitable, down to the teeniest detail. It was all determined by those initial conditions and the laws of nature. Okay, so that might seem sort of jarring, right, to think that we don't actually have any free will, but it's hard to see initially what's wrong with this argument. It seems pretty solid. But one thing that's very much worth pointing out, that's usually discussed when talking about free will, is this has an interesting and pretty significant impact on ethics. So this is a subject in metaphysics, right? What exists and what is it like? So does free will exist and what is it like? And it seems as though we've got an argument saying that no, free will does not exist. At least nothing like the notion of free will that we started with seems to exist. So this is an issue in metaphysics that then has a big impact on ethics. And in fact, that's sometimes thought of as a problem for determinism. But if it's a problem, it's really just a problematic consequence of determinism. It's not so much a problem for the argument itself, because it's not clear that what we're going to talk about in a moment here really shows that the argument in favor of determinism is wrong at all. Instead, it just says, whoa, if that argument is right, then we've got this problem in ethics. And the problem is that it seems to undermine one of the basic foundations of ethics. And the foundation is the ability to hold people morally accountable for their actions. Now, holding people morally accountable, that could mean sort of blaming them for doing something that's morally bad, but then it could also be praising them for doing something that's morally good. And the idea is that to be held morally accountable or morally responsible for your actions, you have to act out of your own free will. It has to be your choice to do what you actually did. It can't be just an accident that you had no decision in, right? It just suddenly you fell into it. And it can't be coercion, right? It can't be something that somebody else forced you to do somehow. So for example, if I decide to ram my car into somebody when I'm driving, well, then I should be held morally accountable for that, I would think, right? I decided to do it. It was something terrible that I did. Presumably this is a perfectly innocent person that I just ran into. And so there's a strong possibility of me doing serious harm to them. So I should be held morally accountable for that bad action. But let's change the situation. Let's say that I did not choose. In fact, I was trying hard to avoid hitting this person, but it was in the middle of winter and the road is icy and I didn't see that it was icy. And I didn't have any reason to think that the road was icy on this particular day, but it turns out it was. So that transparent ice, right, that I suddenly hit and I start to slide out of control and then I hit this person. So something bad happened. Right? So there's still such things as bad things and good things in the world, but I can't, under those circumstances, be held accountable for my actions because it was an accident. I slipped on the ice. And so the idea, if we bring determinism into this, is that that's true for everything, right? You never really make any decision based on your own free will because there is no such thing as free will. So everything that you do is inevitable. You didn't really have any ability to do other than you actually do, so you can't be held morally accountable for what actually happens. And again, like I said, that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as good and bad. There can still be good things and bad things, good results and consequences and bad results and consequences. But the point is that we can't hold people morally accountable, morally responsible for those actions and those results that they bring about. Okay. Now, if you sort of know a little bit about contemporary physics, you might wonder about this determinism argument. In fact, maybe I'll go back to that argument just so we can take another little look at it. This first premise, natural processes unfold according to the laws of nature. Those laws are unbreakable. The results are inevitable. Well, yeah, if you know something about contemporary physics, you might be thinking about quantum mechanics here. So according to the most popular interpretation of what's going on in quantum mechanics, there's actually some randomness involved at sort of the level of the very, very small, the subatomic particle level. There's a certain amount of randomness that happens. So results of natural processes are maybe not so inevitable. Here we have it, right? Quantum mechanics may involve some random events. And so that undermines that first premise of the determinist argument. And so we'd have to change that first premise from the results are inevitable to something like the results are somewhat random. So then that seems to undermine the overall argument that our actions, our decisions are not inevitable, right? They're not determined by, determined precisely by initial conditions and the laws of nature. So is this better? Does this save our notion of free will? Maybe not, right? So what's worse or what's better? The idea that our decisions and our behaviors are absolutely inevitable, or that they're at least somewhat just sort of random, right? So I don't want my actions to be random either. That doesn't seem like it's my choice. That doesn't seem to be saving my notion of free will, that what I do is just like based on nothing, determined by nothing. Right? I want it to be caused by my own personal choices, my own free will. So that doesn't seem like it's better, right? So in fact, it might even be worse. At least under determinism, I can explain why I did what I did. I can talk about initial conditions and laws of nature and explain what happened and why it happened. And it might even give you some insight into my psychology, which of course my psychology has been determined by all of the events leading up to the present moment, but at least I can give a psychological explanation for why I do what I do. But if my decisions are random, well, then there's not even an explanation to be had, and I don't have free will. So this seems worse. But what this seems to do is expose sort of what we might call an incoherence in the original concept of libertarian free will. And by incoherence, I mean that it could be that the concept itself, when we analyze it in this way, ends up not really making any sense. It's not clear what it is that we believed in when we were believing in the existence of libertarian free will, because we want our actions and our decisions and our behaviors to be explainable in terms of some kind of causation. We just, of course, want it to be causation in terms of our own free will. And we don't want our actions to just be uncaused, you know, truly random in that sense. But if our actions really are caused by something, well, that's going to presumably be some kind of natural causation that's making this happen. So then we seem to be back into something more like determinism, right? Causation, any kind of causation that's worthy of the label causation seems to be something that's going to be following certain recognizable and consistent patterns, which we might even call laws of nature. And so it seems like we're sort of stuck saying that either our actions are determined or they're random. But the libertarian doesn't want it to be either of those. So what is it, right? What is this mysterious free will causation that is a real kind of causation, but is not the kind of causation that falls us into determinism, and it's not the kind of causation that's random. So what is it? It's this very fuzzy, mysterious middle ground that we can't seem to really pinpoint. We can't seem to describe what it is or how it's supposed to be working, how it's somehow supposed to get in the way of the laws of nature and cause an actually free decision to be made instead of that decision being determined ahead of time. Okay, well, one way of sort of throwing up your hands here is to say, well, it's just a brute fact. Free will just is a thing, and it has the right kind of causation, the kind of causation we want it to have for libertarian free will, and that's just the end of the story. Okay, well, we do see some things that seem to be like that in physics. So, for example, as you can see on this slide, the speed of light, you know, it's what, 3 × 10⁸ meters per second, somewhere around there. Okay, so why that speed? Why is the speed of light that rather than some other speed? Maybe that's just a brute fact. Why is there light? Why does light exist at all? Why was light a result of the Big Bang? Just is. Same thing with the negative charge on the electron. Why does it have a charge at all? Why are there such things as charges? Why does the charge on the electron have the strength that it has? Why isn't that charge a little stronger or a little weaker? It just is. All right. So these are brute facts. But of course, just saying that something is a brute fact, well, that cuts off any further investigation, and it leaves things completely mysterious and unsatisfying. So, you know, if you want to go that route, I suppose you can, but you have to acknowledge that it is just sort of like throwing up your hands and saying, oh, it's a mystery, and that's it. Okay. Well, there is sort of another approach here. Sometimes it's referred to as something like compatibilism, where we're trying to make compatible two things that initially did not seem compatible. That is the existence of determinism, right? And the non-existence of free will and moral responsibility on the other hand. So how do we maintain some sense of moral responsibility and personal responsibility that we thought was associated with free will in a world where there's no actual free will? So that brings us to A.J. Ayer's work. And some others have certainly worked on this same idea, but I'll start with Ayer's ideas here. So we want our decisions to be caused, right? We've been talking about that so that they can be explainable. We need to be able to explain why we did what we did in order to figure out whether we are morally responsible one way or the other for our actions. But although that might acknowledge something like determinism is the case, what we really want is for our decisions and our behaviors to have the right sort of causes, right? It's not good enough just to say, oh, it was caused, causes are deterministic, so therefore our behavior is deterministic, and so therefore there's no free will. There's a little bit more to the story than that. Because there's all sorts of different causes that could cause us to do what we do. And so maybe what we're really interested in all along is that our the causes of our behavior be the right kinds of causes. So we have to think about then sort of under what circumstances do we think about our decisions and our behaviors being free. You know, so you did something and then somebody asks you, you know, did you choose to do that? Under what circumstances will you say, yes, I own that decision. I'm going to say that that was me who did that. Versus situations like the sliding on the ice example I gave before, where you'd say, yes, like I was involved, right? So I was part of the cause of what happened, but I don't feel like it was a free decision on my part. So I don't feel like I should be held morally accountable. Well, one way of sort of cashing this out, as we say, is to, that the right kinds of causes are mental, internal causes, right? My own psychology, my own preferences and desires and plans are what caused my decision and caused my behavior. Even if those are all determined, if it really was my own personal preferences and desires and plans and so on that caused my behavior, then that's what I'm interested in. That's free will to me. And under those circumstances, I'm going to accept, hopefully, or I should accept moral responsibility for what I've done. As opposed to external causes, right? So the slippery ice, or some big gust of wind, or somebody with a weapon that's forcing me to do this under threat of violence somehow, or, you know, if we got fancier, we might say somebody with a mind control machine that's making me do something. And so it's this external cause that's the main cause for what I've actually done. So still determinism, but since it's an external cause, then I don't take ownership of it, right? It wasn't me that caused that to happen, and so I don't take responsibility. And so it was not something that happened according to my own personal free will. Instead, it was somebody else or some just mindless circumstances that caused me to fall into this. Okay, so maybe that helps to preserve some sense of moral responsibility in the face of a deterministic universe. But there are some puzzling cases still left over. So something like addiction, right? So think of the stereotypical case of a drug addiction. So what's going on here is the person taking the drug, continuing to take the drug because of their own free will. That might seem a little weird, right? I mean, they're addicted. That's why they're taking the drug. And they might even not want to take the drug anymore, but they're still taking it. Right? They want to shake this addiction, but they keep doing it. Why do they keep doing it? Well, they have, to some extent, some internal desire to take that drug, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking it. Nobody external is forcing them to do it. This is all internal to their own mind and their own brain, their own body that's causing them to continue doing this. So how does this not count as a case of free will? Same thing with something like OCD, right? The person who has obsessive compulsive disorder might actually, in one sense, want to stop, for example, washing their hands or checking to see if the oven is still on or something along those lines. They don't want to keep doing that, but then another part of them wants to check, right? Wants to check to see if that oven is on, wants to wash their hands one more time. So there is sort of their own internal desire of some kind that's pushing them to continue doing these compulsive behaviors, but it seems weird to say that it's free will. So one possible extra thing we can say about this that could clear up some of this is to move to what could be called primary and secondary desires. So a primary desire is the desire that has the immediate causation that leads more or less directly to the behavior. Whereas a secondary desire is a desire about your desires. So let's apply that to the addiction case. So let's suppose that the addict wants to stop, but continues to take the drug. So they have a desire to continue taking the drug, and that's their primary desire because that's what leads directly to them actually taking the drug. But they have this secondary desire about their primary desire, and that desire is they don't want to have that primary desire, right? They wish it wasn't there so that they could just stop taking this drug once and for all. So in this case, their primary desire and their secondary desires are not in agreement. They're sort of fighting each other, so to speak. And so under those circumstances, we might say the person is not acting under free will because they don't have their primary and secondary desires in alignment. But let's say that somebody is addicted, but they actually want to continue taking the drug, right? They have absolutely no interest in stopping. I think this is true for example, people that smoke cigarettes or are addicted to nicotine. They might recognize that they're addicted, but they may not really have an interest in stopping, and they're not trying. In fact, they want to continue using the drug. In that case, their secondary desire is in alignment with their primary desire. The primary desire is to continue having the secondary desire is to continue having that primary desire, and that primary desire leads to continuing to use the drug. So under those circumstances, yes, the addict is acting under his own free will. So again, this is maybe a potential solution here to maintain some sense of free will. It's not libertarian free will, because that might be incoherent, right? It might be something that's just impossible. But it's something close enough that we could still talk about having free will, and we could still talk about having moral responsibility, and have that talk actually make sense. Okay, so I think I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks.